The morning was quiet. Too quiet for a battlefield soaked in memory. The old village had changed since the war, but the hills surrounding it still bore the scars of fire. Grass grew where craters once held shrapnel. Trees now whispered where gunfire used to scream. And on this still morning, two men arrived each, carrying a silence that weighed heavier than any uniform they ever wore. One of them was Johann Richter, a former sergeant from the 11th Western Infantry Division. His shoulders once held the burden of orders. Now they sagged under the gravity of memory. Every medal pinned to his old jacket wasn't a trophy, it was a gravestone. He had arrived early, as he always did. Discipline didn't fade with age. He walked slowly toward the old memorial site, cane in hand, back slightly bent, and sat on the weathered bench that faced the rising sun. He didn't expect anyone else. Not really. These kinds of meetings rarely happened. Reunions were for friends, comrades, not enemies. Yet the letter in his coat pocket said otherwise. "I will come," it read, signed only New, a name Johann remembered too well, not from greetings or drinks or laughs, but from war, from blood, from a gun barrel's distance. He closed his eyes and felt the jungle heat again, smelled the gunpowder, heard the screams. It had been 52 years since they met on opposite sides of a narrow trail deep in the Central Highlands. A firefight broke out, chaos erupted, and somewhere in that smoke, Johann pulled the trigger that ended a life, or so he thought. When the dust settled, he had approached the body, just another fallen soldier. But something about the face haunted him. Young, determined, unafraid, even in death. Johann had never forgotten it. Later, much later, through old intelligence reports and veteran stories, he learned the boy was Nujanan's younger brother. That day had made them enemies beyond uniforms. It had tied their fates together with a knot of pain, shame, and silence. And yet, here he was. At precisely 9 o'clock, the gravel path crunched under soft, deliberate footsteps. Johann looked up and froze. Time hadn't been kind to either of them, but he recognized it immediately. The face had aged, yes, but the eyes held the same unshaken steel, tempered now with wisdom and exhaustion, and wore no military symbols. Just a simple white shirt and dark trousers. His left leg dragged slightly, a limp earned not from Johann's rifle, but from a landmine 6 months later. They stood apart for a moment, two ghosts staring through one another. Johann rose to his feet, slowly, unsure whether to offer a handshake or an apology. But before he could move, Anne stepped forward and did the unthinkable. He embraced him. It wasn't a long hug, just enough to crack something inside both men. When they pulled apart, their eyes shimmered not with anger but with the weight of decades. Anne spoke first, his voice lower than Johann remembered from that shouting match so long ago. "I hated you," he said. "For a long time?" Johann nodded. "I hated myself too." They sat on the bench, no words for a while, just the wind through the grass and the calls of birds that didn't care who killed whom. Anne pulled out a small wooden box. Inside it were two photos, one of his brother, in uniform, smiling awkwardly, and another, a crumpled image Johann recognized. Himself, 25 years old, holding a rifle, face still untouched by regret. "I kept this," Anne said, "to remember the face I should have killed but didn't." Johann stared at it, unable to speak. "But now," Anne continued, "I keep it to remind myself what forgiveness costs and what it saves." The silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. And then, slowly, Johann took out his own photograph, a letter, folded and worn thin. It was addressed to Anne's brother, never delivered, never even sent. Just something he had written in a moment of guilt after the war, locked away in a drawer. "I don't know why I brought this," he said. "Maybe to give it to the wind, or maybe to you." Anne took it, hand shaking, and unfolded it. He didn't read it aloud, didn't need to. He read until tears blurred the ink, then folded it again and placed it back inside the box. "We were enemies," Johann said. "We didn't choose to be, but we stayed that way too long." And nodded. "I thought killing you would bring peace. But all these years, I found peace only when I stopped trying to blame you." Johann looked away, ashamed. "I should have said sorry decades ago." "You're saying it now," Anne replied. "And I'm still here to hear it. That's more than many have." Behind them, the sun had risen fully. The warmth touched their skin gently, like a hand on the shoulder from something greater than either of them. And just then, in a quiet, almost fragile moment, both men wept, not from pain, not from anger, but from release, from the breaking of a dam built on silence. The tears didn't fall like storms. They trickled slowly, washing away nothing, but watering something long buried. And neither was ashamed, because for the first time in 52 years, they weren't enemies. They weren't soldiers. They were just men. Survivors. Witnesses. The days that followed weren't loud or public. No headlines screamed of the encounter. No cameras flashed. The world didn't pause for their reunion. But something had shifted, quietly, in both their lives. Johan returned home to the Netherlands with a new heaviness that strangely lightened him. For decades, he had lived in the quiet routine of guilt mowing the lawn with the precision of a soldier, answering phone calls with the guarded tone of someone who had lost the language of openness. But now, he moved slower, more deliberately. As if the past no longer needed to be out, he reopened an old wooden chest at the foot of his bed, one that hadn't been opened in 20 years. Inside were letters he never sent, medals he never wore, and a photograph of a boy with dark hair, and determined eyes, the same one he had seen in an S-box. For the first time, Johan placed the photo on the wall instead of hiding it, not to glorify the war, but to remember its cost. And, in his quiet Hanoi home, also felt something shift. His daughter, Mai, noticed it first. For as long as she could remember, her father had been present, but distant, loving, but guarded. He used to sit by the window for hours, smoking silently, eyes fixed on nothing. But after he returned from that meeting, the cigarettes stopped. He still sat by the window, but now with a book or a notebook. He began writing, not just facts or dates but memories, feelings, regrets, names, faces. He told May that he had finally forgiven someone, and in doing so, had forgiven himself. She had never seen him cry until the day he said, "I thought killing him would bring justice, but meeting him brought me peace." It wasn't long before their story found its way into the hands of others. A young journalist in Da Nang, who specialized in oral histories, heard whispers of the meeting and reached out. At first, both men declined. They weren't interested in being symbols. But something about the journalist's approach, gentle, curious, respectful, made them reconsider. She didn't want a headline. She wanted the truth. And so, they shared it. Not the politics, not the battles, but the moment, the bench, the box, the letter, the silence. The story was published in a small Vietnamese magazine under the title The Bench Between Wars. It gained little traction at first, but then a retired American veteran read it and sent it to a peace foundation in Berlin. The foundation shared it on their website, and within weeks, the story traveled further than either man had ever marched. People began writing letters, dozens, then hundreds. Children of veterans, widows, survivors, even former enemies. "Your story gave my father the courage to speak. I never thought reconciliation was possible until now. I cried for men I've never met, because you reminded me that pain has no nationality." One letter stood out. It came from Eric Johan's son. They hadn't spoken deeply in years, just brief calls, formal holidays, strained smiles. But in this letter, Eric wrote, "Dad, I always wondered why you were so quiet, why there was always something behind your eyes. I think I understand now, and I want to know more." That letter opened a door, long rusted shut. Johan called Eric that night. They spoke for 3 hours, about the war, about the meeting, about the things never said. Eric cried. Johan cried! It wasn't a repair, it was a beginning. Across the world, in Hanoi, a similar call happened. Mai had reached out to Eric after reading the article. 2 children of 2 former enemies, now connecting not through blame, but through the shared inheritance of silence. They began writing emails, then video calls, then finally, a plan. A year later, they met in Quang Tro, on the same land that had once soaked in so much blood. They stood together under the open sky. Mai held a framed photo of her uncle. Eric carried a letter, his father's rewritten version of the one never sent. They read them aloud, not for ceremony, not for cameras, but for closure. Around them stood a small group of people, survivors, descendants, friends. There were no speeches, just a planting. A single tree, an almond blossom, was placed in the earth where a crater once scarred the ground. On its roots, they poured soil brought from both their homes, Vietnamese, Dutch, mixed in peace. Above it, a small sign. Here grew understanding where once grew war. When Johan and Anne saw the photos of the ceremony, they didn't smile. They wept, quietly, in their homes. Apart, yet bound. Johan later told Eric, "I didn't think my hands would ever be used for planting again." And told Mai, I thought my brother died so I would carry revenge, but he died so I would learn to carry mercy. Their story didn't go viral like a scandal. It spread like a whisper, soft, persistent, human. Universities began including the article in conflict resolution courses. Peace organizations referenced it during dialogues. A filmmaker approached the families, wanting to turn it into a short film. At first, the families hesitated, but when they realized it could help others speak, help others forgive, they agreed. The film, titled The Bench, premiered at a modest international human rights festival. It didn't win awards, but during the screening, audience members stayed seated long after the credits rolled. Some prayed. One woman stood and said, "I lost my brother in the war. I never forgave, but tonight, I will try." It was never about becoming famous. It was always about becoming human again. Back in Hanoi, Anne began hosting small gatherings at his home. Veterans, widows, students. He didn't lecture. Sometimes, they sat in silence. Sometimes, they told stories they had buried for half a century. One afternoon, he read a line from a poem he had written years ago and never shared. "If we keep holding rifles in our hearts, even our children will bleed." And in Amsterdam, Johan began volunteering at a hospice for elderly refugees, many of them from conflicts he didn't even understand. He said little, but when they cried, he held their hands. And when they asked, "Why do you do this?" he simply said, "Because someone held mine when I needed it." The world has a strange way of remembering war through statues and silence, parades and pain, but rarely through healing. And yet, the story of Johan and Anne was doing something that neither bullet nor speech had managed to do. It was beginning to bridge what history often leaves broken. What began as a quiet letter, a shared bench, had now become something much larger than either man ever intended. In South Korea, a professor of international conflict studies redesigned her final assignment. Students were now tasked not with analyzing military strategies, but with writing a personal letter of forgiveness to an invisible enemy. In Sierra Leone, a child soldier survivor shared the film The Bench with his community, saying, "They found peace without punishment. Maybe we can too." The story rippled outward like concentric circles on still water, touching places where war had left gaping wounds in Bosnia, in Colombia, in the Middle East. Every echo was different, but all sang the same refrain. Reconciliation is not weakness. It is courage. But back at the heart of it all, Johan and Anne had grown quieter. Their bodies aged faster than their minds. The flame of presence in their eyes still burned, but dimmer. And yet, they felt no urgency to chase legacy. Instead, they felt a gentle calling to prepare the soil for others to grow something new. One evening, Eric sat beside his father, who by now had traded cane for wood. They watched the last light of the sun pour across the tulip fields outside the care home. "Dad," Eric asked softly, "do you think you did enough?" Johan didn't answer at first. Then, he whispered, "I think I did one thing right. I stopped the war inside me." Meanwhile, Mai had begun gathering testimonies from other families, affected by the same conflict that shaped her father. She wasn't a historian by trade, but something in her refused to let the story end with silence. With her father's blessing, she created an online archive, the Quiet War Project, a digital home for stories never told. No politics, no military ranks, just voices, unfiltered, unburied, raw, some filled with grief, some with unexpected grace. And every time someone submitted a memory, Mai replied personally, "You are seen," she wrote, "and you are not alone." One afternoon, a message arrived from someone unexpected, a former American helicopter pilot named Thomas Green. He wrote of a mission in 1971 that had gone wrong, a crash, a boy he couldn't save, and a guilt he had worn like skin ever since. He had watched the film, he had read the article, and for the first time, he said, he slept without dreaming of screams. "I would like to meet the men," he wrote, but Johan's health was fragile by then, and travel was no longer possible. So Mai arranged something else, a digital across 4 continents, through the quiet hum of time zones and aging internet cables. 4 men connected to Johan, Anne, Thomas, and a former North Vietnamese communications officer named Lam. They greeted each other not as soldiers, but as witnesses to a time that stole too much. The conversation was awkward at first. Stutters. But then Anne said something that broke the ice. Maybe war is just the loudest way for humanity to cry. And from there, they spoke as brothers. They talked, not of tactics or generals, but of letters unsent, voices lost, dreams interrupted. Thomas revealed that after the war, He became a paramedic. I spent my life trying to save what I once helped destroy. Lamb shared how he built radios for orphanages in the countryside he once reported from. I wanted to send music where there was only static. Johann listened, eyes full. Maybe we all found a different battlefield. A quieter one. But just as important, they promised to meet again. They never did. Johann passed away the following spring, quietly, in his sleep. A photo of Anne's brother still pinned to the board beside his bed. Eric was with him. He said the last thing his father whispered was, "Tell Anne, we made it." The news hit Anne harder than expected. He had thought himself prepared, but grief never arrives dressed as you imagine. For days, he didn't speak, just sat by the window, the old wooden box unopened on his lap. Then, finally, he lit a candle, opened the box, and read the letter again, the one Johann had written. He read it aloud this time, line by line, voice steady, breaking only once at the words, "I wish it had been me, not him." The world moved on, as it always does. But in quiet corners, libraries, classrooms, refugee shelters, their story continued to unfold. A mural appeared in Warsaw. Two old men shaking hands under a tree that grew rifles into roots. In New Zealand, a children's choir sang a song titled "The Bench Between Wars," written by a teacher whose father had never spoken of Vietnam until he watched the film. And every year, on the date of their meeting, Eric and Mai called each other. No agenda, no formality. Just to say, "We remember." It wasn't the kind of legacy anyone writes in textbooks. It didn't shift borders or rewrite treaties. But it changed something quieter, something deeper. It reminded people that healing is not found in courts or statues. It's found in benches, in the courage to sit across from someone who once made you bleed and say, "Let's stop here." And once said to Mai, "Reconciliation is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a better one." And as he aged, he began working on a book, not a memoir, but a collection of stories gathered through the Quiet War Project. He titled it "Where Bullets Could Not Go." And on the first page, he wrote, "This book is not about war. It is about what came after, and the men who made it possible to live there." Years later, when Mai stood at the International Peace Forum in Geneva, she wore her father's watch and carried Johann's original letter, the one that had never been sent. The room was filled with ambassadors, professors, survivors, skeptics, people hardened by the world and yet drawn to something more vulnerable. She didn't open with credentials. She didn't speak of statistics or resolutions. Instead, she said, "I'm here because my father once tried to kill a man." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was reverent. And as she told the story of the jungle path, the photograph, the handshake, the bench, something in the room began to shift. Eyes softened. Postures changed. For a brief moment, they weren't policymakers. They were people, flesh and memory. And when she finished, she read Johanna's words aloud. "I never knew his name when I pulled the trigger. I only knew his pain when I shook his hand." That night, a candlelight vigil was held outside the forum's hall. Hundreds gathered, not to protest, not to demand, but to remember. Images from the bench were projected on the building walls. Johann and Anand standing under the tree, surrounded by a mosaic of faces, young and old, former soldiers, children of war, artists, strangers. The mural from Warsaw had been recreated live by two young painters, one Polish, one Viet, and below it, in dozens of languages, a single sentence was painted in gold. "Peace begins where understanding lives." An, now too frail to travel, watched from his hospital bed in Hanoi. Mai held his hand as the livestream played. Though his sight had weakened, he still recognized Johann's silhouette in the flickering light. A nurse tried to adjust the volume, but An shook his head. "I don't need to hear it," he whispered. "I remember every word." And then, almost imperceptibly, he smiled. Not a wide smile, but the kind that comes when something deep inside you finally, truly rests. He passed away 3 weeks later, surrounded by family, a sapling growing just outside his window from the seeds he and Johann had once exchanged. It was small, but strong. After his passing, Mai and Eric decided to reunite once more, not for ceremony, but for something simpler. They traveled together to the field where it all began. The bench still stood, though weathered by time. The tree nearby had grown taller, its roots now strong enough to crack the soil where landmines once hid. They sat quietly, the wind brushing past them like an old song. No speeches, no prayer, just two children of enemies who had found something better than revenge. Eric took a small stone from his pocket, etched with both names, Johann and Anne. we remember. He placed it beneath the bench, then stepped back. In the years that followed, the story continued to appear not always in grand places, but in unexpected corners. A classroom in Rwanda used it as part of a forgiveness unit. A small island nation recovering from civil conflict turned it into a community theater piece. And a Japanese sculptor crafted a statue of two hands reaching across a broken rifle, naming it after war. In prisons, in libraries, in camps, people spoke of the bench, not as a film or a story, but as a truth they had needed but never known how to voice. Mai once said during an interview, "The opposite of war isn't peace, it's empathy." She believed that, until we could see ourselves in the eyes of those we once called enemies, the battles would never truly end. And Eric, years into his own quiet activism, often closed his speeches with a line his father had once murmured while half asleep. "We didn't win the war when the guns stopped. We won when the crying started." The bench became a quiet place of pilgrimage. No guards, no gates, just a plaque, carved into weathered stone. They met here, they wept here, and in their tears, we found the beginning of peace. Time, as it always does, moved forward. The names of nations changed. New conflicts rose and fell. But the story of Johann and Anne remained not frozen in stone, but alive in those who chose to listen, in those who chose to reach across instead of strike, and in the children who learned, not through textbooks, but through example, that forgiveness is not forgetting but choosing not to let memory become a weapon. Somewhere, someone sat on that bench, decades later, not knowing the full story, just feeling something sacred in the wind, something heavy and healing in the earth beneath their feet. And maybe that's how peace survives. Not in declarations, but in places, in people, in moments when two hands tremble, then meet and hold on long enough for the pain to turn into something else.